Hello everyone. This week we're going to talk about social and economic inequality. We're going to start by defining it and talking about different sorts of inequality we might be concerned about. We're going to talk about the functional income distribution as well as the individual income distribution, wealth inequality, inequality across groups, mobility, and finally we'll wrap up by talking about some of the causes, consequences, and policy responses to inequality. It's important whenever we talk about inequality to remember that this is a distinct concept from poverty. It's related, but they're distinct. So there are very important reasons to care about poverty, right? We want people to have a certain base level of material means and access to services to live lives where they have a reasonable level of well-being. But inequality has some other implications. So, for instance, many people argue that more unequal societies are in some ways more efficient. There's also a fairness component to it. It just appeals to our sense of justice that a society shouldn't be too unequal. And finally, there may be certain political consequences for the stability of a country. A highly unequal country may not be very politically stable. And so these are all kind of axes on which we should care about inequality, and we'll address some of those later in this talk. Inequality of what? Most often, economists are talking about inequality of income, so the difference in the earnings people bring home week to week, month to month, year to year. Another topic that economists talk about a lot is wealth. So wealth inequality is just stored up income, right? And it's generally far more stark and severe than, for instance, income inequality. But there are other forms of inequality too. For instance, we might care about people having access to certain very important goods or services that are necessary to lead decent lives. Healthcare, food, housing, these sorts of things. And so access to these goods or services are things that we should pay attention to as well. And finally, we might also care about inequality of education or opportunity, because we would like citizens to be productive individuals and for people to fulfill their, highest productivity potential. And we can't do that if people don't have access to training and education. And so these are all different things that we may be concerned about in terms of inequality. But economists are most often going to be focused on the first two here, income and wealth. And that's what we're going to speak about mostly today. So the first approach to thinking about inequality I want to highlight is the functional income distribution. So this is a distribution of income based on the function that different groups hold in society. The most common division that we make is profits and wages, because these are two different categories of income in any market society. Wages go to workers, profits go to capitalists. And so we can look at the wage share of income and the profit share of income to determine how those two different groups of people, workers and capitalists, are doing in a society relative to one another. If you look at this graph here, we've got the green line, which is labor compensation as a percentage of national income. That means wage share. And the blue line is the profit share, corporate profits. There are certain individual profits that are not included in this, which is why the two don't sum to 100% of national income, as you would expect them to. And you can see here, just like any two numbers that are inversely related like this, when one goes up, the other goes down. And we can see that the divergence between income share and profit share has become far more severe in the most recent couple of decades. It's also important to note here that the right axis is for corporate profits, and so these are overall smaller share just because there are fewer individuals who earn this sort of income relative to the massive majority of people that earn wage income. So here's an example that kind of sits behind the last graph we saw, and this is the change in median weekly wages graphed against corporate profits. So we can see here that median weekly wages have essentially remained flat since 1980, as we've discussed previously in this course, but corporate profits have increased massively. The idea here is that total income is increasing as time goes on, and so we would expect wages to rise, but they're not. And so that means that most of the gains of productivity are going into profits and not into wages. And that's something we should be concerned about if we're thinking about inequality between, the group of people that earn profits and the group of people that earn wages. But more often than not, both in the media and within economics, people are talking about individual income distributions. And so this is, rather than looking at groups of people, we're looking at individuals and kind of lining them up. So the two main ways we'll talk about measuring that today are income shares and the Gini coefficient. First, income shares. So this is just a measure of the share of income held by various groups. These could be based on demographics, as we'll do later, but usually it's how much income is held by the bottom 20%, the middle 20%, or the top 1%. And we can look at all of these as different measures. This table below here from your textbook shows that the bottom 20% of the income distribution only earns about 3.1% of total income. Meanwhile, the top 20% of the income distribution, they earn more than half of total income. And so income is quite skewed towards the upper end of the income distribution. If this were, for instance, a perfectly equal society, then there would be no difference between these different income shares. For instance, the bottom 20% would have 20% of the income, the top 20% would have 20% of the income. But even within the top 20%, there is a high degree of inequality. For instance, the top 5% of the income distribution holds more than a fifth of total income in a given year. Here's a graph that illustrates how that has changed over time. Each line is a different estimate of the top 1% income share. The blue one is from one group of researchers who specialize in this. The red one is the Congressional Budget Office estimate, and both of those are pre-tax. So in other words, that is earned income before any of it is taxed by the government. And we can see that these individual researchers working outside the government estimate the top 1% of households earn about 20% of national income. Congressional Budget Office puts it a bit lower at about 15%. And after taxes, because our tax system in the US is minorly progressive, so it transfers income from people with high income to people with low income after government expenditures are taken into account, this top 1% share declines a bit to 12.4% by CBO estimation. But if we pay attention to how this has evolved over time, we can see that as the years go on, the top 1% of earners earn more and more, with variation related to recessions and business cycles. Another way to measure inequality is the Gini coefficient. And so to do this, we need to understand this idea of the Lorenz curve. The Lorenz curve is the curve traced out if you imagine you take every person in a country and you line them up from left to right on the bottom of the graph. And as you move from left to right, you make the height of that graph equal to the sum of the income of everyone who's come before that point on the graph. So the height of the graph is not each individual person's income, but the sum of the income as you've moved across. On the right-hand side, you should always be right up at 100%, and all the way to the left-hand side should be all the way down at 0%. If we do this, it traces out this curve. And what we can do then is we can draw a 45-degree line from 0 to 100%, and we can use a specific ratio of the area of A, here, shaded in blue, over A plus B. And this gives us the Gini coefficient. If a society's income distribution followed that line, as you line people up and take the height based on income, that 45-degree line would represent a society with perfect equality, where each person has the same amount of income. A perfectly unequal society, where one person has all the income, would simply be flat all the way across and then spike to 100% right at the end. If this number is very, very small, then that means that a society is quite equal. If this number gets larger, then that means a society is unequal. I want to do just a very brief example of calculating a Gini coefficient, which is something I might ask you to do on a quiz or exam. So here we've got our graph that we derived this information from. On the vertical axis, we have cumulative percentage of income, and on the horizontal axis, we've got cumulative percentage of households ordered from lowest income to highest income. This lower line here is the Lorenz curve, and the upper line here is the line of equality, the line that would represent a society of perfect equality. And on an exam, I would give you the numbers that correspond to the areas A and B, and you would just have to apply the Gini formula, A over A plus B. If we've got these areas, and let's say that A is equal to 1250 and B is equal to 3,750. So if we plug this all into our formula, what we end up with is 1250 over 3750 plus 1250. Chugging right along, we end up with 1250 over 5,000. And that simplifies down, if we just plug into a calculator, to 0.25. So on a quiz or an exam, I might say, here's one country's Gini coefficient, calculate another country's Gini coefficient, and tell me which country is more unequal. And so if this is higher, then that means that we have a more unequal society. And if it's lower, then that means we have a more equal country or society. This map here expresses the Gini coefficient as a percentage term rather than a decimal, which is what we'll generally do. But you can see how the Gini index changes across countries. For instance, the US lies in kind of the middle of this ranging of Gini indexes here. Europe is far more equal than the US, as is Canada, and a number of different nations are. Some of the most unequal countries are in South Africa and South America. And so just things to keep in mind of how this varies from nation to nation. How has this changed over time? Well, on the right-hand side here, we've got income shares. Top 10% up top, 1% is the black line, and top 0.1%, so 1/10 of 1% of the population. And we can see that there was a high degree of inequality before the 1940s. Then we've got the New Deal policies, and these were very progressive and redistributive, which led to a massive fall in these top-level income shares. This remained fairly stable throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, with a uptick in these income shares as we entered the 1980s. And this is the consequence of a lot of reform policies that took place in the 80s, deregulation, weakening of unions, increased global trade, that disproportionately benefited the top end of the income distribution. We usually call this period and these sorts of policies neoliberalism. Over on the other side here, we've got the Gini coefficient graphed over time, here from about 65 to about 2016. And just a great deal of variation through time as recessions happen. These things generally affect inequality, but we can see a clear pattern that the US's Gini coefficient is increasing over time, thus signifying that we are becoming a more unequal society. Now, wealth inequality is generally far, far more stark than income inequality. Over here, I've got a pie chart that shows different shares for different parts of the income distribution for about from the year 2012. And we can see that the bottom 90%, so 90% of everyone, only holds about 23% of total wealth. That is striking. The top 10%, excluding these kind of the top 1%, so this is the people that sit between 99% and 90%. They hold 35% of wealth. The next kind of iteration of that holds 20%, and the top 1/100th of a percent of the nation's population holds about 11% of the nation's wealth. So this is very, very striking. And there are important reasons for this. A very influential book that speaks about this is Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. It's a very complex book with much to it, but one of the key insights of that book is his so-called R is greater than G. And all that means is he has some very good empirical reasons, looking through capitalist economies in history, to say that the real rate of return on capital, that is essentially the profit rate, is almost always greater than the real rate of growth. Growth is what workers get. As the economy grows, their wages increase, and this is part of the overall growth of the economy. If the real rate of return is always greater than the growth rate, then that means that over time, inequality will get worse within any capitalist country. And this has been a very important revelation for economics almost a decade after the book has been published. So here's a little bit of a different way of looking at inequality. We're dividing it up by different demographic groups. On the right-hand side here, we have median household income, and this is just measured in dollars. And so we can see how household income varies by race, by age, by type of household, and by residence area. And so it makes sense that people that live outside of a metropolitan area, more rural, generally have less access to employment, and so their incomes would be lower. And so this is somewhat what we would expect. Similarly, by type of household, we would expect that a married couple would probably have a higher household income than a single individual. But as we see, it's kind of a signifier of gender income inequality. Single head of household families that are headed by females generally have far lower income levels than similar families headed by men. This is, once again, related to discrimination in employment, occupational crowding, concepts that we've talked about in previous chapters. Similarly, by age, it makes sense that younger people would have lower incomes, and the elderly would also have lower incomes. They are in retirement, they aren't actively earning an income. By race is very important here because there's a great deal of history in the US that means that, for instance, Black and Hispanic people have less access to education and to assets that would help them generate greater incomes. But this disparity is far more stark when we look at the wealth side. For instance, Black households have approximately 1/10 the wealth of white households on average. And so this is definitely largely a consequence of discriminatory practices in the past and present that limit Black households' access to wealth, to income, and then later to wealth. Similar to our age story on the income side, it makes sense that younger people are going to have less savings than older people, less wealth than older people. Households, by education, it's also makes sense. People that generate higher incomes are going to be able to generate greater amounts of wealth. And finally, by housing type, renters have almost no wealth, while owners tend to have some household assets. This is also an artifact of the structure of saving in the U.S. economy, where a great deal of household wealth is in the house in which the individuals inhabit. So economic mobility is something we should also be concerned about. This isn't just inequality, but it's the ability for individuals to change their economic conditions over time. And this is something I'm not going to harp on super detailed, but for people raised in families from the bottom income quintile, so the bottom 20% of the income distribution, 44% are still in that bottom quintile as adults. So only 22% rise up to the second quintile, and about 6% rise all the way up to the top quintile, the top fifth. Meanwhile, people raised in families at the top income quintile are 47% likely to also be in that quintile as adults, with about 25% sliding down by one quintile and about 7% falling all the way to the bottom quintile. So while some economic mobility exists, one's background is clearly an important determinant of your adult income. We can also look at how income changes throughout someone's working career. And these are all for the US case, of course. This is a somewhat different picture in other countries. So there are certain causes that have led to the increase in inequality in the United States over the last few decades. One of these is just demographic change. People have been living longer, and elderly people tend to have lower incomes, but also more wealth. Due to changing legal structures and social conventions, there are more single-parent households which just tend to have lower income, particularly when they are headed by women. And there's also been an increase in people marrying within their own income level. And so this means that you don't have people from the top fifth of the income distribution often marrying people from the bottom fifth of the income distribution. And this matching leads to less mobility in the overall. Very few people marry into richer households, and very few people at the top marry into poor households. Another thing that's going on here is the interplay between the wage share and the profit share that we talked about at the beginning of this. Globalization and trade has disproportionately helped those earning capital income and hurt those earning wage income, at least in the United States. There have also been a great deal of technological changes that have allowed for increased offshoring of jobs that couldn't be offshored before. This has been accompanied by declining labor union power as part of neoliberalism in the 1980s. Essentially, there was a decided effort to reduce unionization in the United States to make our products more competitive on a global scale by making them cheaper, but the flip side is that wages fell. Now, it is important to keep in mind here that this offshoring, while it was not good for inequality in the United States, actually helped global inequality because it raised incomes in the developing world where those incomes were much lower to begin with. So it's something to keep in mind to not just focus only on the United States. There have also been a great deal of policy changes that have helped to amplify profit-based income. There also have been a great deal of policy changes in the US that have amplified profit incomes. For instance, lowering capital gains taxes, lowering inheritance or eliminating inheritance taxes, as well as financial deregulation, which allowed people to earn an even greater rate of return on existing wealth that they invest. So these are all different policies that have had a direct effect on the wage-profit share divide. And this wage and profit share does have a really close relation to the overall income distribution because the vast majority of people earn wage labor, not profit labor. So, some of the consequences of this that we should be concerned about. There are certain welfare implications, especially if we assume diminishing marginal utility of income, or wealth. So the idea here is simply that somebody who goes from $10,000 of income a year to $15,000 of income a year is going to feel a lot better off than from that $5,000 than somebody who makes $1 million a year and suddenly makes $1 million plus $5,000 more, right? The person who's making less money is going to be able to make big changes in their lifestyle, while somebody at the top end of the income distribution or much higher is not going to. That amount of money is not going to make as much of a difference in their lives as far as their total welfare goes. Rich people also just live longer. Life expectancy is highly related to income, and that's controlling for and accounting for quality of healthcare. Some have argued that there's a certain equality efficiency trade-off, but more contemporary research has shown that highly unequal societies actually grow slower than more equal societies. So there may in fact be no trade-off at all. And finally, a great deal of economic inequality can have some consequences for democracy, especially in a country like the United States, where political money from private sources plays a huge role in the process. And so these are all consequences that should concern us. But there are certain ways that we can respond to inequality. So we can tax and transfer. So this would be administered through our tax system and through the system of public benefits. Taxes can be progressive, regressive, or flat. Flat taxes are taxes that tax everyone at an equal percentage of their income. A progressive tax is a tax that taxes people at the upper end of the income distribution more than people at the lower end. And this is what federal income tax is in the US. If you earn more, you start paying a higher percentage on additional income. A regressive tax is just the opposite. It taxes poor people more. A good example of a regressive tax is the sales tax. Because the sales tax taxes people on what they purchase, poor people are spending almost all of their income on consumption goods that they need day to day, while more wealthy people are putting some of that into savings where it is not taxed. And so this sales tax, or what some people will call a consumption tax, is a regressive tax. Other types of taxes that fall into these categories, for instance, a property tax, tends to fall upon wealthier people who are more likely to own durable types of property. And finally, many states have actually implemented flat income taxes, particularly in states with Republican-controlled state legislatures. It's important to note that the overall U.S. tax system, whenever we account for both state, local, and federal tax, has become more regressive over time. So while the federal income tax is progressive, once you include all these state and local level taxes, it becomes more and more regressive. The U.S. system of taxation, in sum, is less progressive than in many European nations. European nations have many more transfer programs that contributes to reductions in inequality, even though their pre-tax Gini coefficients are actually worse than the U.S. in many cases. Another policy response can be different ways of allocating public spending. These could be things like subsidizing primary, secondary, and college education. And empirically, it seems that focusing on primary education is more effective in combating income inequality than focusing on college. There are also other sorts of public spending that are important. For instance, social supports for people without jobs, that helps income inequality, and many others. And so just the way that we spend our dollars has major implications for overall inequality. Certain regulations are also very important. For instance, financial deregulation disproportionately helps people that have money that they can invest. And very, very many people have no money that they can invest. And so altering those regulations changes the way that the income distribution is generated. And finally, we can attack the problem directly through wage policy. So, while minimum wages can be justified for other reasons, economists generally find that increased minimum wages slightly reduces overall income inequality. There are also other forms of wage policy that have been implemented mostly in other countries, where, for instance, the highest paid employee, the CEO, cannot make a certain proportion more than the median employee of the firm. So it could be 100 times or 200 times. These are kind of common numbers. So wrapping things up, inequality is this multidimensional thing. We mostly talk about wealth and income, but we should keep in the back of our minds that we're also talking about access to important goods and services and opportunity. We can look at income by individuals or by income type through a functional income distribution. We can measure income inequality and other forms of inequality in a bunch of different ways, but by all of these measures, it appears that inequality has been getting worse in the United States over recent decades. Wealth inequality is generally going to be far more severe than income inequality. We also have this significant racial and gender income and wealth disparity in this country that is apparent whenever we look at it by demographic group. And finally, inequality has significant effects on individuals and societies, but we have some policy options that can help make it somewhat better. All right, I think that's all I got for this week. Thanks.